Je le disais, nous allons...
As I was saying, now we're going to talk about a serious issue with François-Xavier RUBIN de CERVENS. You're the director of BEA Mer, the Maritime Events Investigation Office in France. We'll all be able to see that with a short video that we should watch together. This is a story of a trawler called the RUBIN. So navigation started with a bit of roll on the port side. Then it was rebalanced thanks to a transfer of diesel during the trip. Three days later, at midnight on 17 November, fishing operations were completed. Around midnight, the crew saw that there was more roll and they were trying to remedy that. Around 1:30, there was seawater ingress in the engine compartment. Around 2:02, a distress call was sent and the lifeboat was deployed. A few moments later, RUBIN sank and took the lifeboat down with it. An event analysis suggests that several factors contributed. According to eyewitness accounts, it's likely that the roll was not sufficiently counted. It's probably because of a mistake in the layout of the diesel transfer system. Water flowing into the hold was detected. The access gate to the engine compartment was open. Because of the waves and weather conditions, water flowed into the engine compartment, and that water ingress started the ship sinking. When they saw the ingress, the crew decided to send a distress call and to deploy the lifeboat. At that moment, none of the three crew members had put their life vests on because they were at the entrance of the crew quarters. The three seamen jumped into the water without any flotation devices. And they were able to climb into the life raft. Then the ship sank. They did not immediately think of using the emergency knife that was on the life raft. Then the ship sank and took the life raft with it because it was still tethered. In a few seconds, the ship sank with the life raft to 38 meters, and after they jumped out of the raft in the dark, two crew members were not able to see if their captain was able to jump out. Well, that's quite a strong video. I've seen it already, but it's still just as impactful after a couple of times. It's quite revealing of what the BEA does. This is your daily bread. Yes, well, it's not exactly what we do on a daily basis, but that's the majority of what we do in our work, because there are a large number of investigations based on casualties. Usually when lives are lost at sea, an investigation is started by the BEA, the director, who has competency to start an investigation. That reflects the type of people involved. When there's an accident, there are different parties involved. Of course, there are the sailors themselves, the company, the judges, and the victims' families as well. So in that case, we engage a lot of different people, including the insurers, because the maritime prefect orders that we bring the ship back up. And so we're in contact with a lot of different types of people, and those who are trickiest to speak to are the families, because when we publish the final report, when there are families and there's a high number of victims, we make a presentation to the families behind closed doors to explain to them what happened. And that's always a difficult part in our work. Regarding our competencies, you can see that in the statistics I'm going to show you. They wouldn't make sense if you're not aware of what we can do. We have competency over civilian ships, whether they fly a French flag or not, anywhere in the world, even if a ship sinks in China. Foreign ships, when they sink in our territorial waters, we have the second largest surface area in the ocean, as the chair of the Maritime Cluster said this morning, because we have all our overseas territories. And we also have competency over sea events wherever they happen, if French interests are involved or French nationals can be impacted. This is why we opened an investigation. We co-opened an investigation because of substantial involvement, because of the implosion of the Titan, that small sub that was off the coast of Canada that imploded. And so we are involved in the investigation with our colleagues, because very often these are international investigations, because you have one flag involved, one nationality for the crew, a couple of coastal states. So all that means that as soon as there's a major accident, really, especially on large boats, we are several investigation offices getting together to have a single investigation or trying to have a shared investigation. Our key word that is very important is that we're not trying to ascribe responsibilities. That's for judges to do. We have no competencies over that. So we're trying to make our reports as neutral as possible so as not to point the finger at anyone. So we were created by a number of international texts, by IMO and in EU directive, and all that was transposed into French law. Next one, please. Or maybe I should click through. So for the past year, 536 accidents inventoried. Don't believe that there were only 536 accidents in France. At the BA Mer, we get about 10,000 incidents a year for sea events. Well, they come mostly from the emergency centers, or from ship owners, from any citizen, concerned citizens, but 90% of these notifications come from emergency rescue centers. So there are about 10,000. Then we have an analysis lens that's been stable for the last few years, and we filter through these events. We extract a few, so 536 out of 10,000. That seems significant, and that could potentially have had much more serious consequences. So that's the order of magnitude, but it's a subjective analysis that is our own, but we think that is quite good. We had 25 casualties or people missing, which doesn't seem that much compared to the routes. However, that's out of a maritime community that's fairly small, and when there are events like the Buggelet-Brest where 3 sailors died or young sailors, then it's widely covered in the press by the media, probably rightly so. And then in terms of persons injured, 200. 37 very serious accidents, either total ship loss or casualties. So you can see there were only 37. What we can say about these statistics, well, there's one element that I can address later, is loss of control. Well, that's you lose control of the ship, and that's a phenomenon that is very important both for fishing boats and cargo ships. A large number of cargo ships break down in our territorial waters off our coasts, and when they're in our 12 miles limit, we record them. So that's very common when they switch over to a different fuel, for instance. But that's one of the #1 causes of recording. If you look at the change in the accidents over the last few years, these are the stable but subjective criteria for BEA-Mer. We have a weird curve, a strong increase during COVID that we can't really account for. Maybe an explanation because of maintenance that was not carried out as well for fishing boats, or because of difficulties in accessing shipyards. But there was an increase during COVID. Then it went down also, but it was still on an upward trend. This upward trend isn't really connected to big ships, because we are lucky to have a merchant fleet that is fairly recent in France with quality crews, quality companies, and the age of vessels is fairly low. But we've got a real split between the large companies, the big ships, and other types of navigation, especially very small navigation and emerging navigation. Here I'm talking about small passenger transport vessels. That's commercial boats that carry less than 12 people, and the risk for passengers is infinitely higher when you're on such a small boat than when you're on a ferry boat, for instance. You can have a ratio, the number of accidents compared to the number of passengers transported, and you can see that the smaller the boat, the higher the risk. So there's kind of a split, and then there's fisheries that's really separate. There hasn't really been a change in the last few years, and that's probably related to the age of fishing boats. Now, if you look at the average age of fishing boats, usually that's 70 to 75% of accidents that we record. They are on average 30 years old. 30 years old, that's a very influential factor on accidents, because these boats were built and designed at a certain point with the then regulations, if they existed at all, because regulations were created later and they were not always retroactive. So these ships became heavier. They were modified for various reasons, more nets, more crew protection systems. And so you can see that there is a large number of incidents, and we don't really have a prospects for a short-term improvement, and the cost is high, and the costs are kept very high artificially because their price is related to their fishing capabilities, and that's kept artificially high to maintain their European subsidies and resources. So you can see that the trade, cargo, and passenger share is fairly high. In these sectors, the highest number of accidents are occupational incidents, engine breakdowns that are in high numbers, and fires. On cargo ships, we had several investigations on big vessels that were modern and high quality, and that was all down to fires. So that's a non-negligible factor that matches global figures. If you look at global statistics, fires on merchant ships, that's the highest factor. BA Mer is working on recommendations to do analyses and understand what happened during the accident and issue recommendations. Everything that we do is fully public. All our reports are published on our website. The video that you saw, like previous ones that are more recent, are there to help students in particular. This is an educational tool for them. All that is public on YouTube and on the website of BA Mer. So a number of recommendations. Last year we issued about 15 recommendations. And we keep track of these recommendations. And they were acted upon or not by the parties to which they are issued. These are not binding recommendations. They are only that. Recommendations in France is not the case everywhere, but in France, the party receiving recommendations has a legal obligation to reply within 3 months. That gives you an idea of the reaction time of some sectors. Sometimes some recommendations are not followed through because in fisheries or small ship owners, once the accident happened, well, the ship owner terminates their business, and so there is no longer any party that we're speaking to because they've given up out of the psychological shock or any shock. But usually, merchant ship owners follow our recommendations with a good ratio. Fishery ship owners, it's a bit more difficult. Then you've got government in charge of the safety of occupational ships. They're some of the best students. Government is sometimes great. And also then yachting is a bit more complicated. That gives you an idea. Our recommendations are not necessarily perfect either. We're trying to issue recommendations or apply recommendations that are as balanced as possible. We're trying to reduce the number of recommendations every year, but to improve the quality. The difficulty is that when you issue recommendations, some are more complicated than others to monitor, especially for government, but they are the most valuable because when you issue a recommendation to a whole sector or to IMO or Europe, the population that you reach is much higher than if you issue a recommendation to just one ship owner or one vessel. The value is not the same.
So it gives you an idea what this can lead to. So now I just want to say a few words about a topic that I find very interesting, but that can also be useful for our analysis because 90% of accidents are related to human factors or organizational factors. And talking about human factors, the impact of fatigue. So it might sound a little silly, but the fatigue factor is very significant, in particular for seafarers, because people work in a very different context than other jobs, except maybe for astronauts who will remain on their spacecraft for a long time. But it's a very specific context because you live where you work for a period of time. So on this graph, you can see the circadian cycle, and it shows that there are times of the day where our body temperature goes down, other times when it goes up, and it shows that we are not made to work at night. And this can have an impact. So this is particularly true for the marine sector when people are working over a long period of time. Some studies were conducted, some more interesting than others. And I chose here one which is probably more telling, and this is the study that was used by IMO. This study shows that the higher your rank, the more you will get tired over time, meaning that the higher the level of responsibility, the more you will feel fatigue over time. So if you take the example of an able seaman, after 4 months of voyage, he will be probably less tired than the captain or the head mechanics. Another important finding is that over time, fatigue will build up. And this fatigue can no longer be compensated with sleep. So here you can see that part of the graph is going up suddenly. And since we're all different, it's difficult to determine exactly when this breaking point will happen, when fatigue will increase suddenly. And when we look at accidents, very often in our investigations, we look at the 24, 48 hours prior to the accidents. But this is not enough. We should actually investigate a longer period of time leading to the accident. And in everything that we analyze, taking into account human factors that lead to 90% of accidents, there are other analyses that were carried out. So when you feel extreme fatigue, your reactions will be different. So your reactions will be different, and also you will not be aware of the fact that you are in a different mental state. And studies show that if we run tests on students, we can see that after a certain level of fatigue, respondents considered that they were completely able. However, they failed about half of their tests that they were able to pass perfectly when they were not feeling any fatigue, when they were not tired at all. So it's the same thing as a driver who feel that they are perfectly able to drive their car when they're not. So this is really the message that I wanted to share here today. Well, thank you for your attention. So maybe we have enough time for a couple more questions. First of all, you've talked a lot about fishing. So what about cargo? About carriage of goods? Are there many accidents? Well, there are many accidents, but in our investigations, thankfully, because of our fleet, these investigations were more related to fires that did not lead to any casualties. And we discussed it this morning. Yes, and there were some collisions as well. So Ulysses that collided against Virginia as well. So there was a total loss of the ship. So this was not nothing. And this was mainly related to human factors. So that's an example. And for cargo ships, there were casualties, but they were more related to work accidents. And touching wood, thankfully, there were no dramatic accidents as opposed to other countries. But there are some ro-ros, passenger boats that have experienced accidents, but we're quite lucky to have a very well-trained seamen and to have a pretty young fleet. So is there a message that you would like to share with our audience, and in particular with insurance companies? Well, maybe several messages. Well, first of all, insurers, in a way, are multi-purpose partners. Insurers can play a fundamental role in terms of safety. We tend to forget it, but it is thanks to insurers that the first classification companies were established with the first rules. So I think that the role of an insurer is paramount because when we talk about the triangle of marine safety, we often mention the ship owner, the authorities, the classification companies, and sometimes we forget about the insurer while they play a very important role for the insurance premium, of course, and what is acceptable or not. And they can maybe sometimes be more reactive than policymakers. Policymakers will sometimes take longer to react to technological breakthroughs. If I take the example of small submarines that tend to replace secondary boats in some cases, and that's just an example. And insurers also contribute to regulatory changes. And one speaker this morning said that that insurers need to be involved in this. I worked at IMO for 5 years, and I was a French representative to IMO. And I think that insurers could be more involved because you have some data and some very accurate analysis of this data. And I had very good relations with some insurers when I was at IMO. And I know that there are some criteria taken into account to determine the level of risk and the price of the premium for a certain voyage. And the French delegation includes people from the authorities, but not only. But I do not recall seeing many representatives from insurance companies. So I think that this is an important message that we can share today. It's important to have your feedback and for you to be able to share your knowledge. Right, so this is a very strong invitation, and I'm sure that our audience will take good note of it. Thank you.